The blade was pressed against her throat before she even opened her eyes. Elara did not flinch. She had trained her body to stay calm, even when death stood an inch away, and this was nothing new. She let her breathing slow, counted the weight of the hand that held the knife, and waited for the right second to move. But then a voice broke through the darkness of the tent, low and amused, and she realized this was not an attack. It was a test. "You did not scream," the voice said. "Most girls scream." She opened her eyes slowly, and looked into the face of the man, who would soon be called her husband. Kalen Thorne, the ruler the southern kingdoms called the Wolf King, was not what the stories described. He was not a monster with claws and fangs. He was a tall man with sharp eyes, a face carved by years of war, and a stillness about him that made the guards around him seem restless in comparison. He pulled the blade away from her neck and studied her, the way a hunter studies tracks in the snow, searching for something that did not fit. "I do not scream at shadows," Elara said quietly, sitting up on the thin mat that had been her bed for the journey north. "A knife at my throat is not the worst thing I have faced." For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. Then it was gone, replaced by the practiced coldness of a king who trusted no one. "You will learn to fear worse things here," he said, and left the tent without another word. 3 days earlier, Elara had stood in the throne room of Vera, listening to the council debate her fate, as if she were a piece of furniture to be moved from one room to another. The kingdom had lost too many soldiers in the border wars. Villages had burned, grain stores had emptied. The treaty offered by the Wolf King was the only path to peace, and the price of that peace was a bride, sent north, to bind the two kingdoms together through marriage. No one asked Elara if she wanted to go. No one asked because no one truly knew who she was. To the council, she was an orphan, raised in a quiet corner of the capital, a young woman with no family to object and no political value to lose. They saw a plain face, a soft voice, and hands that trembled just enough to seem harmless. They did not see the years she had spent in the shadows of the Ashvale house, where children with no name and no history were shaped into something the world was never meant to notice. They did not know that her trembling hands could end a life in less time than it took to blink, or that her soft voice had once talked a dying man into revealing the location of an entire smuggling ring before he took his last breath. The Ashvale Order had been destroyed 2 winters ago, burned to the ground in a single night by enemies who wanted its secrets buried forever. Elara was the last one who walked out of that fire alive, and she had spent every day since then hunting for the answer to a single question: who had given the order to burn her family, the only family she had ever known? The trail of that answer led north, into the territory of the Wolf King, and now, through nothing but strange fortune, the council had handed her the perfect disguise: a bride, a woman no one would suspect, a weapon walking straight into the heart of the enemy's court, wrapped in silk and presented as a gift. She had accepted the arrangement without hesitation. The council mistook her calm for resignation. In truth, it was relief. She would have found a way north, with or without their permission. This only made the journey easier. The road to the Wolf King's territory wound through mountains that grew colder and sharper with every mile. Villages became sparse, then vanished entirely, replaced by forests so thick that daylight barely touched the ground. The soldiers who escorted her spoke in hushed voices about the stories they had heard, tales of the Wolf King's cruelty, of villages that defied him and disappeared overnight, of a court where whispers of betrayal ended in silence and empty chairs at the dinner table. Elara listened to every story without comment, filing each detail away the way she had been trained to do since she was old enough to walk. Stories were rarely the full truth, but they were never entirely false either. Somewhere inside every rumor was a thread worth pulling. On the 4th day of travel, the convoy was ambushed. It happened fast, the way real danger always does. One moment the road was quiet, lined with tall pines and the soft crunch of horse hooves on frozen dirt. The next moment, arrows split the air, and men in dark cloaks poured out from behind the tree line, blades drawn, shouting for the guards to surrender the bride. The soldiers scrambled to form a defensive line around Elara's carriage, but panic made them slow. She watched through the small window as 2 guards fell within seconds, and she understood immediately that these were not ordinary bandits. Their movements were too coordinated, their formation too deliberate. This was a planned strike, not random opportunity. She could have stayed inside the carriage and let the guards fight, playing the frightened bride the council believed her to be. It would have been the safe choice, the expected choice. But safety had never been her instinct, and expectation had never been her master. When one of the attackers ripped open the carriage door, expecting to find a trembling woman curled in the corner, he found instead a fist that struck his throat with precision, honed over years of brutal training. He dropped without a sound. Ilara moved past him into the chaos, keeping low, using the confusion of battle as cover. She disarmed a second attacker by twisting the blade from his grip and using his own momentum to send him crashing into a tree. She did not kill either man. She had learned long ago that a body left breathing could sometimes answer questions that a body left silent never could. By the time the guards regrouped and pushed the remaining attackers back into the forest, the danger had passed. Ilara stood near the carriage, her dress slightly torn, her breathing steady, looking every bit like a woman who had simply been fortunate enough to survive. "How did you get free?" the captain of the guard asked, staring at her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "I do not know," she said, letting a tremor slip into her voice, the practiced fear of a woman who understood how the world expected her to sound. "I was so frightened, I think I just ran." The captain did not fully believe her. She could tell from the way his eyes lingered on the unconscious men near the tree line, men who had clearly not simply fallen on their own. But he had no evidence, only instinct, and instinct was not enough to accuse the bride of the Wolf King of anything. Still, word of the strange survival spread quickly through the convoy, whispered between soldiers who exchanged uneasy glances whenever Ilara passed. She noted their suspicion, the way she noted everything, filing it carefully away, understanding that from this point forward, she would need to be far more careful with her mask. The fortress of the Wolf King rose out of the mountains, like something carved by the hands of giants, dark stone walls stretching upward until they disappeared into low clouds. Ilara had heard descriptions of it during the journey, but nothing prepared her for the sheer scale of the place when it finally came into view. Towers stood like watchful sentries along the outer walls, and banners bearing the sigil of a silver wolf snapped in the wind atop each one. The gates opened as the convoy approached, and a small procession of court officials came forward to greet them. Ilara stepped down from the carriage with practiced grace, keeping her eyes lowered just enough to appear humble without seeming weak. She had learned that true strength was often best hidden behind the appearance of softness. Predators who assumed their prey was harmless made careless mistakes, and careless mistakes were exactly what she needed if she hoped to find the truth about who had destroyed everything she once loved. A woman with sharp cheekbones and calculating eyes stepped forward from the group, introducing herself as Reyna, the king's spy master. Her gaze lingered on Ilara a moment longer than courtesy required, studying her the way one studies a puzzle with missing pieces. "The king will see you at dinner," Reyna said. "Rest until then. The journey north is never kind to southern blood." Ilara offered a polite nod and allowed herself to be led into the fortress, memorizing every hallway, every guard position, every exit along the way. It was a habit she could not turn off, even if she wanted to. Knowledge was survival, and survival was the only thing that had never failed her. Her chambers were larger than anything she had lived in during her years with the Ashvale house, though the space felt less like comfort and more like a gilded cage. Thick tapestries lined the stone walls, and a fire crackled in a hearth large enough to warm the entire room. She moved through the space slowly, cataloging details the way she had been taught. A window that overlooked the eastern courtyard, a door that led to a private hallway rarely used by servants, a loose stone near the base of the fireplace that might hide a passage, though she would need more time to confirm it. As evening approached, a servant arrived to help her prepare for dinner, laying out a deep blue gown, embroidered with silver thread, that mirrored the wolf sigil of the kingdom. Ilara studied her own reflection in the mirror as the servant worked, searching for any sign that her disguise had cracked, any hint in her expression that might betray the truth of who she really was. She saw only a calm, composed woman, exactly the image she needed the court to believe. The great hall of the fortress was filled with nobles and officials by the time she arrived, all of them turning to study the southern bride, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. She kept her chin lifted just enough to seem confident, but not so high that it appeared defiant. Balance was everything in a court like this, where a single misstep could brand her as either weak or dangerous, and either label carried its own risks. Kalen sat at the head of the long table, a goblet of wine untouched in front of him, his eyes tracking her movements as she approached. He gestured for her to sit at his right side, and the court watched in silence as she lowered herself into the chair, every motion measured and deliberate. "You survived an attack on the road," Kalen said, cutting straight past any pleasantries. "Tell me how." The hall grew quiet enough that she could hear the fire crackling in the hearth across the room. "I was frightened, my lord," she said softly. "I do not remember much beyond running, until the fighting stopped." His eyes searched hers for a long moment, and she held his gaze without flinching, letting him see exactly what she wanted him to see. A frightened girl caught in circumstances far beyond her understanding, nothing more. "Interesting," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Because 2 of the attackers were found unconscious, disarmed with wounds, that suggest training, not luck." The hall seemed to hold its breath. "Perhaps the gods favored me," Ilara said, keeping her voice steady, refusing to let even a flicker of tension show on her face. Kalen studied her a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a low sound that seemed to surprise even the nobles seated nearby. "Perhaps they did," he said, lifting his goblet in a mock toast toward her. "Welcome to my court, little wolf." The dinner continued, filled with careful conversation and the watchful eyes of nobles who clearly did not trust the southern bride seated beside their king. Ilara played her role perfectly, offering just enough charm to seem likable, just enough hesitation to seem harmless, all while quietly studying every face in the room, searching for any connection to the fire that had destroyed her home 2 winters ago. She noticed an older nobleman near the far end of the table who avoided her gaze entirely, his hands trembling slightly whenever her name was mentioned. She noticed a younger official who watched her with open admiration, the kind of attention that could be useful later if she needed information. She noticed the careful way Reyna observed everything, from the shadows near the hall's entrance, missing nothing, trusting no one. By the time dinner ended, and she was escorted back to her chambers, Ilara understood one thing clearly. This court was a nest of secrets, and somewhere within its walls was a piece of the truth she had traveled so far to find. She would need patience, precision, and above all, the perfect mask, because a single mistake here would not simply mean exposure. It would mean death, and not just her own. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, staring up at the shadows dancing across the stone ceiling, she thought about the fire that had taken everything from her, about the screams she still heard in her dreams, about the promise she had made to herself as she walked away from the ashes of her only home. She would find whoever was responsible, no matter how long it took, no matter what disguise she had to wear to get there. Somewhere in this fortress, surrounded by wolves who did not yet know they had welcomed a hunter into their den, the truth was waiting. And Ilara intended to find it, one careful step at a time, no matter the cost. Outside her window, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the distant call of actual wolves echoing across the valley, a sound that felt less like a warning and more like a promise of the danger that lay ahead. Sleep did not come easily. Ilara lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the fortress settling around her, the creak of old stone, the distant footsteps of guards on their rounds, the wind pressing against the shutters like something trying to get inside. She had slept in far worse places during her training, in caves with no fire and forests with no shelter. Yet this room, warm and soft as it was, felt more dangerous than any of them. Comfort had a way of making people careless, and she refused to let herself grow careless here. When the fortress finally quieted, she rose from the bed and moved silently to the window, watching the courtyard below. Guards walked their patrols in predictable patterns, pausing at the same points along the wall, exchanging the same brief words with each rotation. She counted the seconds between their movements, memorizing the rhythm the way a musician memorizes a song. Patterns were the language of safety in a place like this, and she intended to learn every verse. Her mind drifted, as it often did in quiet moments, back to the night the Ashvale house burned. She had been 17, returning from a mission that had taken her 3 weeks to complete, walking the last mile home with the satisfaction of a task finished cleanly. She smelled the smoke before she saw the flames, and by the time she reached the ridge overlooking the valley, Where her home had stood hidden for generations, there was nothing left to save. The building that had raised her, trained her, given her purpose when the world outside offered her nothing, was a wall of fire reaching toward a sky that did not care. She remembered running down the hill, remembered the heat against her face, remembered pulling 3 of her brothers and sisters from the wreckage before the roof collapsed entirely. Only one of them survived the night, and he had died 2 days later from wounds too deep for any healer to mend. She remembered kneeling in the ashes at dawn, alone for the first time in her life, and making a promise to every person who had died in that fire. She would find who did this, and she would make certain they answered for it. The trail had been cold for months after that. Whoever ordered the attack had covered their tracks carefully, hiring mercenaries who knew nothing beyond the coin they were paid and the location they were given. It took nearly a year of careful investigation, following whispers through taverns and battlefields, before she found a single thread worth pulling. A merchant, dying from a wound in some forgotten border skirmish, had confessed with his final breaths that the order to burn the Ashvale house had come from someone connected to the Northern Court, someone with enough wealth and influence to hire an army of mercenaries without leaving a trace. The Northern Court, the territory of the Wolf King. It was not proof, not yet. A dying man's words were not evidence a court of law would accept, and Elara did not intend to seek justice through courts that had never protected people like her in the first place. She intended to find the truth herself, piece by piece, and when she found the person responsible, she would decide their fate with her own hands. The council's decision to send a bride north had seemed, at first, like an impossible stroke of fortune, the kind of opportunity she could never have engineered on her own. She had almost laughed when the announcement was made, imagining the counselors patting themselves on the back for finding a bride with no family to protest, never realizing they had handed a hunter the exact key she needed to walk straight into the heart of her prey's territory. Now, standing in the darkness of her new chambers, watching the guards below complete another rotation along the wall, she understood that fortune alone would not be enough. The Wolf King was sharper than the stories suggested, and his spymaster missed nothing. She would need every skill the Ashvale house had given her, and she would need to be patient enough not to reveal her purpose before she had gathered enough proof to act. A soft sound near the door pulled her attention away from the window. She moved without hesitation, positioning herself beside the frame where she would have the advantage against anyone entering. The door opened slowly, and a young servant girl stepped inside, carrying a tray with tea and a small selection of bread, clearly unaware of how close she had come to startling someone capable of ending her life before she could make a sound. "I did not mean to wake you, my lady," the girl said, her voice trembling slightly as she noticed Elara standing near the door instead of in the bed. "I was told to bring something warm, in case you could not sleep." Elara relaxed her posture immediately, softening her expression into something gentle and grateful. "Thank you," she said. "I could not sleep. The mountains are colder than I expected." The girl set the tray down on a small table near the fire, glancing nervously around the room, as though searching for something out of place. "The kitchens say you fought off 2 men on the road," she said quietly, unable to hide her curiosity. "Is it true?" "I was frightened," Elara said, repeating the same careful answer she had given the king. "I do not remember much." The girl nodded, though her eyes suggested she did not fully believe the story either. Word traveled fast in a place like this, and Elara understood that every servant, every guard, every noble in the fortress would soon have their own version of the tale, each one growing more exaggerated than the last. She would need to manage the story carefully before it grew into something impossible to control. After the servant left, Elara sat near the fire and drank the tea slowly, letting the warmth settle into her hands as she considered her next steps. She needed allies within the fortress, people who could offer information without realizing they were doing so. She needed to identify who among the court held real power, and who merely appeared to. And most importantly, she needed to find any connection between the nobles here and the mercenaries who had burned her home 2 winters ago. The older nobleman who had avoided her gaze at dinner lingered in her thoughts. His discomfort had felt different from the simple suspicion the rest of the court held toward her. It had felt like guilt, the kind of unease that came from a man who knew more than he wanted anyone to discover. She made a note to learn his name and his history before the week was finished. As the fire burned low and exhaustion finally began to pull at her, Elara allowed herself one final thought, before sleep took her. The Wolf King had called her Little Wolf, a nickname meant perhaps as mockery, perhaps as something closer to respect. He had no way of knowing how close to the truth the name actually was. She was not the frightened bride the council believed they had sent north. She was a hunter who had simply chosen, for now, to wear the softest disguise she owned. And somewhere within these cold stone walls, the truth she had traveled so far to find was waiting to be uncovered, one careful step at a time. Morning arrived with a pale light that filtered weakly through the mountain clouds, and Alara rose before the servants came to wake her, already dressed and composed by the time a soft knock sounded at her door. She had learned long ago that the first hours of a new place revealed more than any formal tour could offer, so she made her way through the fortress corridors with the practiced ease of someone who belonged there, greeting guards with polite nods and letting her eyes map every hallway, every stairwell, every door that led somewhere the court likely did not want her to see. The fortress was larger than it appeared from outside, a maze of stone hallways connecting towers, halls, and chambers, built across generations, by rulers who valued defense above comfort. She found the library first, a quiet room lined with shelves that stretched to the ceiling, filled with histories of the Northern Kingdom that she intended to study carefully once she found the time. She found the training yard next, where soldiers sparred under the watchful eye of an instructor who barked corrections in a voice loud enough to echo off the surrounding walls. She resisted the urge to linger there too long, aware that showing too much interest in combat would raise questions she was not yet ready to answer. It was in the eastern garden, a small space tucked between two towers where frost still clung to the edges of dormant flower beds, that she encountered Kalen again. He stood alone near a stone bench, staring out over the mountains with an expression that seemed, for a brief moment, less like a king and more like a man carrying a weight he rarely allowed others to see. "You rise early," he said without turning, somehow aware of her presence before she made a sound. "Old habits," she replied, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "I find it difficult to sleep in unfamiliar places." "This will be your home now," he said, finally turning to face her. "Perhaps you should grow familiar with it." "I intend to," she said, meeting his gaze steadily, though a home built on suspicion is difficult to feel comfortable in. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise at her honesty. Most people who spoke to him chose their words with careful caution, wrapping every sentence in flattery or fear. She had offered him neither. "The court does not trust easily," he admitted. "Southern brides have arrived before, sent as symbols of peace that lasted only as long as it took for the ink to dry on a treaty. My advisors expect you to be another empty gesture." "And what do you expect?" she asked. He studied her for a long moment before answering. "I have not decided yet." The honesty in his answer surprised her more than she expected. She had anticipated arrogance, the kind of cold certainty rulers often wore like armor, but instead, she found a man who seemed to weigh his words as carefully as she weighed her own, someone who understood that trust, once broken, was rarely repaired. Over the following days, Ilara settled into the rhythm of court life, learning the unspoken rules that governed every interaction within the fortress walls. She learned which nobles held genuine influence over the king's decisions, and which merely postured for position they did not truly possess. She learned that Rhaena's loyalty to Kalen ran deeper than simple duty, forged through some shared history the court whispered about but never spoke of directly. She learned that the older nobleman who avoided her gaze was named Lord Halden, a man who controlled trade routes along the eastern border, and who seemed increasingly nervous each time her name was mentioned in his presence. She began attending council meetings at Kalen's request, seated quietly near the back of the chamber, while advisors debated matters of trade, border security, and the ongoing tension with rival territories that had never fully accepted the Wolf King's rule. She said little during these sessions, choosing instead to observe, cataloging every alliance and rivalry that revealed itself through tone and body language rather than words. It was during one such meeting that she first noticed the pattern that would change everything. The council was discussing a series of raids along the southern trade routes, attacks that had grown more frequent over the past year, striking merchant caravans with precision that suggested more than simple banditry. Kalen listened with visible frustration, demanding answers his advisors could not provide, until Lord Halden spoke up with a suggestion that struck Elara as oddly specific. Perhaps the attacks are meant to weaken trust between the North and South, Halden said, his voice carrying just enough confidence to seem helpful, while avoiding any real commitment to the theory. A calculated effort to unravel the very peace this marriage was meant to secure. Kaelin's eyes narrowed slightly. You suspect someone within my own court is working against this treaty. I suspect nothing, my lord, Halden said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Only that such things have happened before, in other kingdoms, under similar circumstances. Elara filed the exchange away carefully, noting the slight tremor in Halden's hands as he spoke, the way his eyes flicked toward her for a fraction of a second, before returning to the king. It was a small thing, easily missed by anyone not trained to notice details others overlooked, but it confirmed a suspicion that had been growing since her first night in the fortress. Lord Halden knew something about the attacks on the road, something he was desperate to keep hidden. That evening, she requested a private audience with Kaelin, using the excuse of discussing wedding preparations to gain access, without raising suspicion among the court. When they were alone in his private study, surrounded by maps and documents detailing the kingdom's borders, she chose her words carefully. The attack on the road when I traveled north, she said. It troubles me still. Kaelin looked up from the documents spread across his desk, studying her, with the same careful attention he gave to matters of state. You claimed not to remember much of it. I remember more than I told the captain, she admitted, watching his reaction closely. The attackers moved with training, not desperation. They knew exactly where to strike the convoy for maximum confusion. That is not the behavior of common bandits. You have military knowledge, he said, and it was not a question. She hesitated only briefly, before deciding that a partial truth would serve her better than continued denial. I spent time around soldiers before coming here. I learned to recognize certain patterns. It was not the full truth, but it was closer than anything she had offered before, and she watched him carefully to gauge whether he believed her. His expression remained unreadable for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, as though filing the information away for later consideration. Lord Halden has grown nervous since your arrival, he said, surprising her with his own observation. I had assumed it was simple discomfort with change. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps, she agreed carefully. I will have Reyna look into his recent dealings, Kaelin said. Quietly. If there is a connection between him and the attacks on the road, I want proof before I move against a member of my own council. Elara nodded, satisfied that her careful planting of suspicion had taken root, without revealing more of her own knowledge than necessary. If Reyna's investigation confirmed Halden's involvement in hiring mercenaries, it could open a path toward understanding whether his corruption extended further, perhaps even connecting him to the mercenaries who had destroyed her home 2 winters ago. As she prepared to leave his study that evening, Kaelin's voice stopped her at the door. You are not what the council described, he said quietly, a frightened orphan, with no opinions of her own. She turned back to face him, keeping her expression carefully neutral. People often see what they expect to see, my lord. And what should I expect to see, when I look at you? He asked, his gaze steady and searching. For a moment, she considered offering him the truth, or at least a fragment of it. The urge surprised her, given how carefully she had guarded her identity throughout her entire life. But instinct held her back, the same instinct that had kept her alive through years of dangerous missions. Someone trying to survive in a place that does not yet trust her, she said instead. Nothing more complicated than that. He studied her for a long moment, and she could not tell whether he believed her, or simply chose not to press further. Good night, Elara, he said finally. It was the first time he had used her name instead of the mocking title he had given her that first night, and something about the way he said it, quiet and deliberate, lingered with her, long after she returned to her chambers. Over the following week, the investigation into Lord Halden progressed slowly, with Reyna uncovering evidence of unusual payments made to unknown parties around the same time the attack on the road had occurred. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to justify closer scrutiny. Elara continued playing her role within the court, offering just enough insight during private conversations with Kaelin to prove her value, without revealing the true depth of her knowledge or training. She found herself, almost against her intention, growing more comfortable in his presence. Their conversations, initially guarded and formal, began shifting towards something more genuine, filled with debates about strategy and governance that reminded her uncomfortably of the intellectual challenges she had once shared with her Ashvale family. She reminded herself constantly that this comfort was dangerous, that every moment of connection risked exposing the truth she had traveled so far to protect. But some nights, lying awake in her chambers listening to the wind howl through the mountains, she wondered whether the mission that had brought her north was beginning to change into something she had never anticipated. The fortress, once a stranger's territory filled with suspicion, was slowly becoming something that felt, uncomfortably, like it could be a home. And that realization frightened her more than any blade ever had. The wedding date had not yet been set, though the court spoke of it constantly, treating the eventual ceremony as inevitable, even while Kaelan himself remained curiously silent on the matter. Alara used the uncertainty to her advantage, embedding herself deeper into the daily workings of the fortress, under the excuse of learning the customs she would need to know as future queen. In truth, every lesson, every conversation, every quiet hour spent wandering the halls served a different purpose entirely, drawing her closer to understanding the web of power that surrounded the Wolf King. She spent time with the head steward, a patient older woman named Marion who managed the fortress with quiet efficiency and knew more about the daily movements of every noble and servant than anyone in the court realized. Through careful questions disguised as simple curiosity, Alara learned that Lord Halden had once served as advisor to Kaelan's father, a position that granted him influence far beyond what his current title suggested. She learned that his loyalty to the current king had always been questioned, though never openly challenged, since no one had ever produced evidence strong enough to justify action against him. She learned too about Reyna, whose devotion to Kaelan ran deeper than professional duty. The two had grown up together within the fortress walls, childhood companions who had survived the brutal reign of Kaelan's father, a ruler even the current court spoke of, only in careful whispers. Marion mentioned, almost in passing, that Reyna had once saved Kaelan's life during a rebellion attempt years earlier, an act that had cemented a bond neither of them had ever fully explained to the wider court. This information reshaped how Alara viewed the spymaster's constant surveillance. Reyna was not simply performing her duty when she watched Alara with such careful suspicion. She was protecting someone she considered family, someone who had already survived betrayal from those closest to him. Understanding this made Alara more careful, not less, aware that earning Reyna's trust would require far more than simple charm or clever words. The opportunity to prove herself came sooner than expected, during a formal banquet held to celebrate a minor military victory along the eastern border. The great hall was filled with nobles dressed in their finest clothing, musicians playing softly near the far wall, servants moving between tables with trays of food and wine. Alara sat beside Kaelan as custom now dictated, watching the room with the same careful attention she gave to every gathering, searching for anything that felt out of place. She noticed him before anyone else did. A servant near the kitchen entrance, moving with a stiffness that did not match the fluid grace of someone who had worked in the fortress for years. His eyes tracked Kaelan's movements with an intensity that had nothing to do with simple attentiveness to a king's needs. Alara's instincts, honed through years of training that had taught her to recognize danger before it fully revealed itself, screamed a warning that something was wrong. She watched the man approach the table, carrying a tray of wine, his hands trembling slightly, as he moved closer to where Kaelan sat engaged in conversation with a visiting dignitary. The tremor was subtle, easily mistaken for simple nervousness in the presence of royalty, but Alara recognized it for what it truly was. Fear, the kind of fear that came from someone about to do something they knew could not be undone. She rose from her seat with practiced calm, moving toward the servant as though simply requesting more wine for herself, positioning her body between him and Kaelan without drawing attention to the maneuver. As the man reached for a goblet, she caught the flash of something small and metallic hidden in his sleeve, a blade concealed against his wrist, angled in a way that suggested a target closer than the wine he pretended to serve. Instinct took over before conscious thought could catch up. She grabbed his wrist with a grip far stronger than any noble lady should possess, twisting his arm at an angle that forced the hidden blade to clatter uselessly against the stone floor. The servant gasped in pain and surprise, and the sudden movement finally drew the attention of the surrounding guests, conversations dying into stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Guards rushed forward immediately, restraining the man before he could attempt any further action. while the hall erupted into a mixture of gasps and frightened murmurs. Kalen rose from his seat, his expression shifting from confusion to sharp understanding as he saw the blade lying on the floor near Alara's feet. "He meant to strike you," Alara said quickly, offering the explanation she had already prepared. "I saw the blade in his sleeve and reacted before I could think." It was, technically, the truth, though it left out the years of training that had made such a reaction possible in the first place. The court would need a simpler explanation than the reality, one that did not raise more questions than it answered. Guards dragged the failed assassin from the hall for questioning, while Kalen turned to face Alara with an expression she could not fully read, somewhere between gratitude and deep suspicion. "That was no accident of luck," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "No untrained hand disarms a man that quickly." "I was frightened for you," she said, though even to her own ears, the excuse sounded thin against the reality of what had just happened. "We will speak of this later," he said, and something in his tone told her the conversation would not be one she could easily deflect. The banquet resumed after a tense interval, though the mood in the hall never fully recovered, nobles casting careful glances toward Alara throughout the remainder of the evening, whispering theories about the Southern bride, who had somehow moved faster than trained guards to stop an assassination attempt. She endured their stares with practiced composure, though she understood clearly that her careful disguise had suffered a serious crack, one that would be difficult to repair. Later that night, Kalen summoned her to his private study, the same room where they had spoken about Lord Halden weeks earlier. This time, the atmosphere felt entirely different, charged with a tension that made the air feel thin. "Tell me the truth," he said, standing near the fireplace with his arms crossed, studying her with the intensity of a man determined to find answers. "No more excuses about frightened instincts or fortunate accidents. Who trained you?" Alara stood silently for a long moment, weighing the risks of honesty against the growing impossibility of continued deception. Her instincts warned her that revealing too much too soon could destroy everything she had worked to build, both her disguise and the fragile trust that had begun forming between them. But she also recognized that continued denial, in the face of evidence he had now witnessed with his own eyes, would only deepen his suspicion and push him toward conclusions far more dangerous than the truth itself. "I cannot tell you everything," she said finally, choosing her words with careful precision. "Not yet, but I promise you, whatever training I have, it was never meant to bring harm to you or your kingdom." "That is not an answer," he said, frustration edging into his voice. "I have a court full of enemies who would love nothing more than to see this treaty fail, and I find myself unable to determine whether the woman sent to secure peace between our kingdoms is protecting me or positioning herself to strike when the moment serves her best." The accusation stung more than she expected, though she understood why he would consider it. Trust, in a place like this, was earned through years of proven loyalty, not weeks of careful conversation, and a single instinctive act of protection. "If I wanted you dead," she said quietly, meeting his gaze without flinching, "you would already be gone. I had countless opportunities before tonight, moments when no one would have suspected me, when your own guards stood too far away to intervene. I have done nothing but protect you since I arrived in this fortress, even when protecting you meant risking exposure of secrets I am not yet ready to share." Her words hung in the air between them, and she watched something shift in his expression, the sharp suspicion softening slightly into something closer to careful consideration. "Why should I believe that?" he asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "Because if I were your enemy," she said, "I would not have stopped that blade tonight. I would have let it find its target, and used the chaos to disappear before anyone realized what had happened." He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words against everything he had witnessed since her arrival, searching for the lie he expected to find and struggling, perhaps for the first time, to locate it. "I will not force the truth from you tonight," he said finally, "but understand this. My patience has limits, and secrets in this court have a way of becoming weapons in the hands of those who seek to destroy what little peace we have managed to build. If you are truly here to protect this treaty, then you will need to trust me eventually, just as I am choosing, against my better judgment, to extend you trust now." It was more than she had expected, and far more than she felt she deserved, given the deception she continued to maintain. She nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he offered, even as guilt settled uncomfortably in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, and for once, the words carried more genuine emotion than her careful training usually allowed. As she returned to her chambers that night, the fortress quiet around her, Alara found herself troubled by thoughts that had nothing to do with her original mission. The mercenaries who burned her home, the trail leading toward this northern court, the careful investigation into Lord Haldan's possible involvement, all of it remained important, unfinished business she refused to abandon. But somewhere in the weeks since her arrival, something unexpected had begun to grow alongside that mission, a genuine respect for the man she had been sent to deceive, and a discomfort with the lies she continued to tell him, that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. She did not yet know what to do with that discomfort. But she understood, lying awake as the mountain wind howled outside her window, that the path ahead had grown far more complicated than she had ever anticipated when she first accepted this dangerous assignment. The days following the banquet passed differently than any that had come before. Word of the failed assassination attempt spread through the fortress like fire through dry grass, and though the official story insisted the attacker had been a desperate man acting alone, few among the court believed such a simple explanation. Whispers followed Alara wherever she walked, some laced with suspicion, others with something closer to grudging respect. She had become, almost overnight, a figure the court could no longer dismiss as a harmless southern bride. Reyna requested a private meeting with her 3 days after the incident, summoning her to a small chamber near the fortress archives that Alara had not yet explored. The spymaster stood near a narrow window when Alara arrived, her posture rigid, her expression carefully controlled in the way of someone accustomed to hiding every true thought behind a mask of professional calm. "You saved his life," Reyna said without preamble, turning to face her visitor. "I have spent weeks searching for a reason to distrust you, and instead, you gave the court a reason to trust you more than I would like." "I did what anyone would do," Alara said carefully, though both women understood the statement was far from true. "Anyone would not have moved that fast," Reyna countered, stepping closer, her sharp eyes studying Alara with an intensity that made pretense feel dangerously thin. "I have trained soldiers for 15 years. None of them react with the precision I witnessed that night. Where did you learn to move like that?" Alara considered her options carefully, aware that Reyna's loyalty to Kaelin made her both a potential threat and, if handled correctly, a potential ally. Lying to someone whose entire profession revolved around detecting deception seemed increasingly futile, yet the full truth remained too dangerous to share until she understood more about where true loyalties within this court actually rested. "I lost my family when I was young," Alara said, choosing a version of the truth that revealed just enough to satisfy curiosity, without exposing everything. "The people who raised me afterward believed that a woman without protection needed to learn how to protect herself. I learned quickly, out of necessity rather than choice." Reyna studied her for a long moment, and Alara could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing the partial truth against everything else she had observed. "That explains skill," Reyna said finally, "but not the presence of mind you showed identifying a threat before anyone else in that hall even noticed something was wrong. That kind of awareness comes from training, not survival alone." The observation was sharper than Alara expected, and she understood in that moment that Reyna was far more perceptive than the court gave her credit for, perhaps even more perceptive than Kaelin himself. Continuing to deflect would only deepen suspicion rather than ease it. "The people who trained me were thorough," Alara said, allowing a small measure of honesty to color her voice. "They are gone now. I do not speak of them often." Something in her tone must have carried genuine grief, because Reyna's expression softened slightly, the sharp suspicion easing into something closer to cautious understanding. "Loss changes people," Reyna said quietly. "I understand that better than most in this fortress." The conversation shifted after that, moving into territory that felt less like interrogation, and more like two women who had both survived difficult pasts, finding unexpected common ground. Reyna spoke, carefully and without excessive detail, about the rebellion that had nearly claimed Kaelin's life years earlier, about watching him grow from a frightened young heir into a ruler determined never to repeat his father's cruelty. Alara listened closely, gathering information that helped her understand the man she had been sent to deceive, with far more depth than she had possessed before. "He does not trust easily," Reyna said near the end of their conversation, "but when he does extend trust, he protects it fiercely. Do not waste what he is offering you." The warning carried weight, and Alara understood it was not simply advice but something closer to a test, Reyna watching to see how she would respond to the suggestion that Kaelin's trust was valuable and worth protecting. "I have no intention of wasting it," Alara said, and meant every word, even as guilt tightened uncomfortably in her chest over the secrets she continued to keep. The investigation into Lord Halden progressed slowly over the following weeks, with Reyna uncovering additional evidence linking him to unexplained payments made to individuals whose identities remained frustratingly difficult to trace. Alara contributed what insight she could, without revealing the true depth of her own knowledge, offering observations about Halden's behavior that helped narrow the scope of the investigation, without exposing her own suspicions about his possible connection to the attack on her family 2 winters ago. Kaelin grew increasingly preoccupied during this period, torn between managing the ongoing investigation and addressing rising tension along the eastern border, where reports suggested rival territories were testing the strength of his rule, now that peace with the South had removed one significant threat from consideration. Alara found herself drawn deeper into these discussions, offering strategic insight that surprised even herself with its clarity, drawing on lessons the Ashvale House had taught about warfare, politics, and the delicate balance required to maintain power without inviting rebellion. "You think like a strategist," Kaelin observed one evening, as they reviewed reports together in his study, the fire casting long shadows across maps spread between them. "Not like someone raised in a quiet corner of Vera with no political education." "Perhaps your assumptions about Southern orphans need revising," she said, deflecting with practiced ease, even as she recognized how close his observation had come to the truth. He studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his expression that made her wonder exactly how much he had already guessed about her true nature. "Perhaps they do," he said finally, returning his attention to the map without pressing further, though she could tell the question remained unresolved in his mind. Their relationship, forged initially through suspicion and necessity, had shifted into something Alara found increasingly difficult to categorize. Conversations that once felt like careful maneuvering between potential adversaries now carried genuine warmth, moments of shared laughter over minor court dramas, quiet discussions about governance that revealed a ruler far more thoughtful and burdened by responsibility than the frightening reputation attached to his title suggested. She found herself, against every instinct her training had drilled into her, beginning to care about his well-being beyond what her mission required. The realization troubled her deeply, especially given the secret she continued to carry, the suspicion that someone within this very court might hold responsibility for the destruction of everything she had once loved. If Lord Halden's guilt was confirmed, and if that guilt somehow connected to Kaelin's own knowledge or authority, she would be forced to reconcile the growing respect she felt for him against the promise she had made to herself in the ashes of her burned home. That reconciliation, she suspected, would not come easily. One evening, as autumn deepened into the sharper cold of early winter, Alara found herself walking alone through the eastern garden, where she had first spoken privately with Kaelin weeks earlier. The frost had spread further across the flower beds, and bare branches reached upward against a sky heavy with the promise of snow. She sat on the same stone bench where she had once found him lost in thought, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness away from the constant vigilance her role demanded. Footsteps approached from behind, and she recognized the rhythm before she turned, already knowing who had joined her in the quiet garden. "You look troubled," Kaelin said, settling onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the evening chill. "I am thinking about home," she said, offering a fragment of truth that felt safer than the full weight of what actually occupied her mind. "Vera?" he asked. "Somewhere else," she said quietly. "A place that does not exist anymore." He did not press for more detail, and she appreciated the restraint, understanding that he recognized the boundaries of what she was willing to share, even as his curiosity clearly remained unsatisfied. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the last light of day fade behind the mountain peaks, and Alara found herself, for just a moment, allowing herself to imagine a version of her life where the mission that brought her here did not exist, where she could simply be a woman, sitting beside a man she was beginning to trust, without the weight of vengeance and deception pressing constantly against every interaction. The moment could not last, she knew, but for that brief span of quiet evening light, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace, even as the truth waiting to be uncovered continued its slow, inevitable approach. The evidence against Lord Halden finally solidified on a morning, heavy with the season's first snowfall. Reyna arrived at Kaelin's study with a stack of documents recovered from a secret correspondence hidden within Halden's private chambers, proof of payments made to a mercenary company operating along the southern border, the same company whose methods matched the precision of the attack Alara had survived on her journey north. The documents did not explicitly name the Ashvale house, but the dates aligned closely enough with the destruction of her home that Alara felt her pulse quicken the moment Reyna laid the papers across the desk. "He has been selling information to rival territories for years," Reyna explained, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Payments for troop movements, trade route details, and apparently, contracts for mercenary strikes disguised as random banditry." Kaelin read through the documents with a growing storm building behind his eyes, each page deepening the fury of a man who had trusted an advisor his father once relied upon, only to discover that trust had been betrayed for years without detection. "Bring him to me," he said finally, his voice quiet and controlled in a way that felt far more dangerous than shouting would have. Alara remained silent throughout the exchange, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. If Halden had been selling information and hiring mercenaries for years, there remained a strong possibility that he held direct knowledge of who had ordered the attack on her family, perhaps even direct involvement in arranging it. The proof she had traveled so far to find might finally be within reach. Lord Halden was brought before Kaelin within the hour, his usual composed arrogance replaced by visible panic the moment he saw the documents spread across the desk. He attempted denial at first, insisting the correspondence had been forged by enemies seeking to discredit him, but his protests grew increasingly desperate as Kaelin methodically dismantled each excuse with evidence Reyna had gathered over weeks of careful investigation. "You sold information about troop movements to rival territories," Kaelin said, his voice cold with barely restrained fury. "You arranged mercenary attacks disguised as banditry, endangering innocent travelers along routes you knew my kingdom needed to keep secure. How many lives have you cost with your greed, Halden?" "I did what was necessary to survive," Halden said, his voice cracking under the weight of exposure. "Your father's rule left this kingdom fractured. I simply ensured my own position remained secure, regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed." Alara stepped forward then, unable to contain the question burning inside her any longer. "2 winters ago," she said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling tightly in her chest. "Did you arrange an attack on a hidden compound in the southern mountains, a place housing an order of trained fighters who kept no political allegiance to any kingdom?" Halden's eyes flickered toward her with something close to recognition, though confusion quickly followed. "I do not know what you speak of," he said, and something in his tone, genuine bewilderment rather than practiced denial, made her stomach sink with disappointment. "I have arranged many contracts over the years, but I do not recall anything matching that description. Perhaps another buyer sought those services." The response felt honest, in a way his earlier denials had not, and Alara understood with growing frustration that her search had not yet reached its true destination. Halden was guilty of betrayal, of endangering countless lives for personal gain, but he was not the one responsible for the fire that had destroyed her family. Someone else, someone whose identity remained hidden within the tangled web of northern politics, still carried that guilt. Kaelin ordered Halden taken to the fortress dungeons pending formal judgment, the once powerful lord dragged away by guards, while the remaining court officials watched in stunned silence, absorbing the reality that betrayal had existed within their ranks for years without detection. As the chamber slowly emptied, Kaelin turned to Alara, his expression thoughtful. "That question you asked him," he said quietly, once they were alone. "It seemed personal." Alara hesitated, weighing the wisdom of continued silence against the growing difficulty of maintaining her careful deception. The trust between them had deepened significantly over recent weeks, and she found herself increasingly uncertain whether continued secrecy served any purpose, beyond protecting a mission that had already led her toward one important truth. even if not the specific answer she sought. It was personal, she admitted finally. The place I mentioned, the Order of Trained Fighters, that was my home. I was raised there, trained there, until it burned 2 winters ago. I have been searching since then, for whoever ordered its destruction. Kalen's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise giving way to understanding, and finally something that looked remarkably like relief. That explains everything, he said quietly. Your skill, your instincts, your careful observation of everyone in this court. You were never simply a frightened bride sent north for peace. No, she said, meeting his gaze steadily, prepared finally to offer him the truth she had guarded so carefully since her arrival. I am the last surviving member of the Ashvale Order. I accepted this arrangement because it offered the perfect opportunity to search for answers within your court, answers I believed might be connected to the destruction of everything I once loved. She watched him carefully, waiting for anger, for betrayal, for the harsh judgment she had feared since the moment she first considered revealing the truth. Instead, he remained quiet for a long moment, processing the revelation, with the same careful thoughtfulness he applied to every difficult decision. You believed someone in my court was responsible, he said finally. Perhaps you believed I was responsible. I did not know, she admitted honestly. The trail led north, toward territory under your rule. I could not be certain of your involvement, or your innocence, until I had gathered enough evidence to understand the truth. And now? He asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had not heard from him before. What do you believe now? Ilara considered the question carefully, drawing on weeks of observation, of watching him navigate difficult decisions with fairness and restraint, of witnessing his genuine grief over the corruption within his own court, of understanding, through countless quiet conversations, that this was a man who carried the weight of his kingdom with far more care than the frightening reputation attached to his title suggested. I believe you are not responsible, she said quietly, but I still believe the answer exists somewhere within your territory, connected perhaps to Halden's dealings, or to someone else entirely, that we have not yet identified. Kalen nodded slowly, absorbing the revelation with a composure that impressed her even as relief settled through her chest, grateful finally to have shared the truth after weeks of careful deception. Then we will find that answer together, he said. You should not have to carry this search alone any longer, Ilara. Whatever resources this kingdom possesses, they are yours to use in finding the truth about what happened to your family. The offer carried more weight than she had expected, a genuine commitment from a ruler who had every reason to feel betrayed by weeks of careful deception, yet who instead chose understanding and partnership over anger. Something shifted within her chest, warm and unfamiliar, as she recognized the depth of trust he was choosing to extend, despite everything she had hidden from him. Thank you, she said quietly, and the words carried more genuine gratitude than she had expressed to anyone since the night her home burned to ashes around her. Over the following days, their partnership deepened into something neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though both understood the shift had occurred. Kalen assigned additional resources to investigating Halden's remaining contacts, searching for any connection to the specific mercenary group responsible for destroying the Ashvale compound. Ilara worked alongside Reyna, whose earlier suspicion had transformed into genuine respect once Kalen explained the truth of her background, though he was careful to share only what Ilara herself had authorized him to reveal. The investigation revealed a complicated web of contacts, mercenary companies operating across multiple territories, payments, routed through intermediaries, designed specifically to obscure the identity of whoever had commissioned the original attack. Progress felt frustratingly slow, each new lead requiring careful verification before it could be trusted. Yet Ilara found herself grateful for the support of allies who genuinely wanted to help her find answers, rather than facing the search entirely alone, as she had for the past 2 years. Late one evening, as she reviewed documents alongside Kalen in his study, their shoulders close enough to touch as they examined a particularly promising lead together, she found herself studying his profile in the firelight, struck by how naturally this partnership had formed between them, how far removed their current relationship felt from the wary suspicion of their first meeting. We will find them, Kalen said quietly, noticing her attention and meeting her gaze directly. Whoever destroyed your home, whoever took your family from you, I promise you that. The certainty in his voice, the genuine commitment behind his words, settled something within her that had remained unsettled since the night of the fire 2 winters ago. For the first time since walking away from the ashes of everything she had once known, she allowed herself to believe that justice might actually be within reach, and that she would not need to face whatever confrontation awaited her entirely alone. Winter settled fully over the mountains in the weeks that followed, blanketing the fortress in snow that made travel along the northern roads nearly impossible. The isolation, rather than slowing the investigation into Halden's network, seemed to accelerate it, as though the confined quiet of the season pressed everyone within the fortress walls toward answers they had previously lacked the focus to pursue. Alara spent long hours in the archives alongside Reyna, cross-referencing shipping manifests and mercenary contracts against dates that mattered only to her, searching for the single thread that would finally connect the destruction of her home to a name she could confront. It was Marion, the quiet steward who managed the fortress with such careful attention, who provided the breakthrough neither Alara nor Reyna had anticipated. During a routine conversation about supply deliveries, she mentioned almost in passing that a merchant caravan had arrived from the southern mountains 2 winters ago, carrying goods that seemed unusually valuable for a simple trading expedition, goods that had been purchased by a nobleman who no longer held a position at court, a man named Corwin Vane, who had left the fortress under circumstances Marion described only as unusual. The name meant nothing to Alara at first, but Reyna's expression sharpened immediately upon hearing it. Vane served as Kaelin's uncle's advisor before the old lord died, under suspicious circumstances, Reyna said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone piecing together a puzzle that had remained incomplete for years. He disappeared from court shortly after that death, and no one questioned his departure too closely at the time. The political situation was already unstable enough, without stirring further controversy. Alara felt her pulse quicken as new possibilities unfolded before her. Where did he go? I do not know, Reyna admitted. But if he was involved in acquiring unusual goods around the same time your home was destroyed, it seems worth investigating further. The search for Corwin Vane consumed the following weeks, tracing scattered records through correspondence that had passed through numerous hands over the past 2 years. Alara found herself growing increasingly restless as each lead required careful patience she struggled to maintain, her desire for answers pressing constantly against the methodical pace such investigations demanded. Kaelin noticed her growing tension during their evening reviews of the gathered evidence, offering quiet reassurance that felt, despite everything, genuinely comforting. Patience does not come naturally to you, he observed one evening, watching her pace restlessly near the fireplace in his study, rather than sitting to review documents as she usually did. Patience was never something my training emphasized, she admitted, a rare flash of dry humor slipping into her voice, despite the weight of the ongoing search. Speed and precision, yes. Patience, less so. He smiled, a genuine expression that had grown more frequent in her presence over recent weeks, softening the sharp angles of his face into something that reminded her, uncomfortably, of how attractive she found him, beyond simply respecting his character as a ruler. She pushed the thought aside quickly, uncertain what to do with feelings that complicated an already difficult situation. We will find him, Kaelin said, echoing the promise he had made weeks earlier. Vane cannot have vanished entirely without leaving some trace behind. The trace, when it finally emerged, came through an unexpected source. A trader passing through the fortress during a brief break in the winter storms mentioned, during casual conversation with kitchen staff, that he had recently completed business with a reclusive merchant living in a remote valley several days east of the fortress, a man who matched Vane's description and who had grown increasingly paranoid about visitors over recent months, insisting on unusual security measures that seemed excessive for someone claiming to be a simple trader. Kaelin organized a small expedition to investigate the lead personally, insisting despite Reyna's objections that Alara accompany him, given her direct connection to the potential outcome. The journey east proved difficult, winter storms making the mountain paths treacherous, but Alara found herself grateful for the physical challenge after weeks confined to archives and careful document review. Movement suited her better than patience, action better than waiting. They arrived at the remote valley after 4 days of difficult travel, finding a modest estate tucked into a sheltered clearing, surrounded by dense forest, clearly designed for privacy rather than comfort. Guards patrolled the perimeter with a level of vigilance that suggested genuine fear rather than simple caution, confirming Reyna's earlier suspicion that whoever lived here had reason to worry about being found. Kaelin's small party approached under a flag of peaceful intent, though Alara noted with careful attention every possible escape route and defensive position the estate offered, unwilling to be caught unprepared regardless of how the encounter unfolded. A servant met them at the gate, disappearing briefly to inform the estate's owner of their arrival before returning to grant them entry. Corwin Vane had aged considerably since whatever image Reyna remembered from his time at court. His hair grayed and his posture stooped with a weariness that suggested years of looking constantly over his shoulder. He met them in a modest study, his expression shifting from polite confusion to genuine alarm the moment he recognized Kaelin's identity. "My lord," he said, bowing awkwardly, his hands trembling in a way that reminded Alara uncomfortably of Halden's nervous behavior weeks earlier. "I did not expect visitors from the fortress. To what do I owe this honor?" "We are investigating events from 2 winters ago," Kaelin said, his tone carefully neutral, despite the tension evident in his posture. "Specifically, unusual goods purchased around that time, connected to the destruction of a compound in the southern mountains." Vane's face drained of color so quickly that Alara understood immediately they had found the right man, even before he spoke another word. "I do not know what you speak of," he said, his voice cracking with obvious panic. "You do," Alara said, stepping forward, unable to contain the urgency that had driven her across 2 years of searching. "I need the truth. Who ordered the attack on the Ashvale compound? Was it you, or did you simply arrange the transaction for someone else?" The directness of her question seemed to break whatever remaining composure Vane had managed to maintain. He sank into a chair near his desk, his hands covering his face, as though the weight of years spent hiding this secret had finally become too heavy to carry any longer. "I did not order the attack," he said, his voice muffled but clear enough to hear. "I was paid to arrange the mercenary contract, nothing more. I did not know what they intended to destroy, only that the payment offered was substantial enough to secure my silence and my departure from court, before anyone connected me to the transaction." "Who paid you?" Kaelin demanded, his voice sharp with barely controlled fury, at the casual admission of involvement in destroying an entire family for simple financial gain. Vane hesitated, fear warring visibly with whatever remained of his self-preservation instincts. "If I tell you," he said finally, "I am as good as dead. The person who paid me holds more power than you realize, my lord, power that extends beyond the borders of your own kingdom." "You are already dead if you do not tell me," Alara said, her voice cold with a controlled fury that surprised even herself, years of careful patience finally cracking under the weight of standing so close to the answer she had sought for so long. "I have spent 2 years searching for whoever destroyed everything I loved. You will not leave this room without giving me a name." Something in her tone, perhaps the barely restrained danger beneath her carefully controlled words, finally broke through Vane's remaining resistance. He looked up at her with something close to genuine fear, understanding perhaps for the first time that he was speaking not simply to the Wolf King's future bride, but to someone whose capacity for violence matched anything the Northern Territories had ever produced. "Lady Ashford," he whispered finally, the name falling from his lips like a confession he had carried too long. "Countess Miriam Ashford, ruler of the Western Territories bordering the Southern Mountains." She believed the Ashvale Order posed a threat to her ambitions, that their independence and skill made them dangerous to anyone seeking to expand power without opposition. She paid for the attack through intermediaries, careful never to leave direct evidence connecting her to the destruction. The name settled into Alara's memory, with the weight of 2 years finally reaching their conclusion. Countess Ashford, a ruler she had heard mentioned occasionally during her travels, but had never suspected of any connection to the tragedy that had defined her entire existence since that terrible night. "Why?" she asked quietly, needing to understand the full scope of what had destroyed her family, before she could decide how to proceed with the truth, finally within her grasp. Why would an independent order of trained fighters threaten her ambitions enough to justify their complete destruction? Vane's expression grew even more haunted as he continued his confession. "The Ashvale Order had been approached, I believe, by rival factions seeking to hire their services against the Countess's expanding territorial claims. She discovered this negotiation before it could be finalized, and chose to eliminate the threat entirely, rather than risk facing trained fighters loyal to her enemies. The revelation struck Alara with unexpected force. Her family had died not through random cruelty or simple greed, but because of political maneuvering they had likely known nothing about, caught in the crossfire of ambitions that had nothing to do with their own quiet existence in the southern mountains. The senselessness of it, the casual disregard for so many lives simply because they represented a potential inconvenience to someone else's expanding power, settled into her chest with a grief that felt, somehow, sharper than the anger she had carried for 2 years. Kaylin's hand found hers, a quiet gesture of support that grounded her in the present moment, even as old wounds reopened with fresh intensity. "We have the name now," he said quietly. "We have somewhere to direct our search for justice." Alara nodded, though the path forward from this point remained uncertain, complicated by the reality that Countess Ashford ruled territory beyond Kaylin's direct authority, meaning any pursuit of justice would require careful diplomatic navigation, rather than simple confrontation. But for the first time since the fire that destroyed her home, she finally possessed the answer she had traveled so far and sacrificed so much to find. The confrontation with Ashford, she understood, would come eventually. But first, she needed to decide exactly how justice should be delivered, and whether the woman standing beside her, the Wolf King who had become far more than a mission or a disguise, would stand with her when that final reckoning finally arrived. The return journey to the fortress felt heavier than the trip east had been, snow falling steadily around their small party as they retraced the difficult mountain paths, each mile carrying Alara further from the confession that had finally answered the question defining 2 years of her life. Kaylin rode close beside her throughout the journey, offering quiet companionship rather than forced conversation, understanding intuitively that she needed space to process the weight of what they had learned. They arrived back at the fortress as another storm rolled in from the northern peaks, the great gates closing behind them against wind that howled through the courtyard with bitter intensity. Reyna met them immediately upon their return, her expression shifting from relief at their safe arrival to careful concern as she read the tension evident in both their postures. "You found him," she said, not quite a question. "We found the truth," Kaylin confirmed, leading them toward his study where the fire still burned despite his absence. Servants, maintaining the space in anticipation of his return. Countess Ashford ordered the destruction of Alara's home. Vane arranged the mercenary contract but held no deeper involvement beyond that transaction. Reyna's expression darkened with recognition. Ashford has grown increasingly aggressive in expanding her territorial claims over recent years. This matches patterns we have observed but never fully understood. The three of them spent the following hours reviewing everything they now knew, mapping out the political landscape that would need careful navigation before any confrontation with the Countess could be attempted. Ashford's territory bordered Kaylin's kingdom to the west, connected through treaties that had maintained uneasy peace for generations, treaties that would complicate any direct action against her, without risking a broader conflict that could destabilize the entire region. "We cannot simply march against her with accusations alone," Reyna cautioned, spreading maps across the study table that illustrated the complex web of alliances surrounding Ashford's territory. She has cultivated relationships with several neighboring rulers, relationships built on mutual benefit that would likely draw them into her defense if we moved against her without overwhelming evidence. "Vane's confession alone will not be enough," Kaylin agreed, frustration evident in his voice as the complexity of the situation became clearer. "We need documentation, financial records, something that connects her directly to the mercenary payments beyond a single frightened man's testimony." Alara listened to their careful strategic discussion, understanding the wisdom behind their caution, even as impatience burned within her chest. 2 years of searching had led her to a name, but justice, she was beginning to understand, would require far more careful work than simple confrontation could provide. The Ashvale training had taught her patience for individual missions, careful stalking of specific targets over days or weeks. But this challenge demanded something different entirely. Patience measured in months rather than days. Careful political maneuvering rather than direct action. "I need to see her," Alara said finally, breaking the strategic discussion with a statement that drew both Kaylin and Reyna's immediate attention. "Not to confront her. Not yet. But I need to understand her. to see the woman responsible for destroying my family with my own eyes before we decide how to proceed." Kaylin studied her carefully, clearly weighing the risks of such a request against her evident need for some form of closure, beyond simply knowing a name. "That would be dangerous," he said finally. "If she suspects your true identity, your connection to the Ashvale Order, she may act to eliminate the final witness to her crime, before we can gather sufficient evidence against her." "I am aware of the risk," Ilara said steadily, "but I have spent 2 years searching for answers. I cannot simply wait in this fortress while others determine how justice should proceed. I need to be part of this, Kaylin. Not as a bystander protected from danger, but as someone actively working toward the resolution I have sacrificed so much to find." Something shifted in his expression, understanding replacing his initial concern, as he recognized the truth in her words. This was not simply a matter of protecting her from danger, but of respecting her agency in determining how she pursued justice for the family she had lost. "Then we will find a way for you to see her," he said finally, "but carefully, with protections in place that minimize the risk to your safety." The plan that eventually formed involved a diplomatic gathering scheduled for early spring, an annual meeting of regional rulers that Ashford traditionally attended to maintain her political relationships across the Northern Territories. Kaylin would extend an invitation for Ilara to accompany him as his future queen, providing a legitimate reason for her presence, without raising suspicion about her true purpose in seeking proximity to the Countess. The weeks leading toward that gathering passed with careful preparation, Ilara working alongside Reyna to develop a persona that would allow her to observe Ashford closely without revealing any hint of her true connection to the Ashvale Order. She practiced masking her instinctive reactions, training herself to remain calm and composed, even while standing before the woman responsible for the deepest tragedy of her life. Kaylin, meanwhile, worked to strengthen his own political position, meeting with allied rulers to build support that might prove necessary should the confrontation with Ashford eventually require military backing, rather than simple diplomatic pressure. Their partnership, forged initially through suspicion and secrecy, had transformed into something that felt increasingly like true collaboration, two people working together toward a shared goal that had become, somewhere along the difficult journey, deeply personal to both of them. It was during one of these preparation sessions, late in the evening as snow continued falling steadily outside his study window, that Kaylin finally addressed something that had remained unspoken between them, despite weeks of growing closeness. "When this is finished," he said quietly, setting aside the documents he had been reviewing to look at her directly, "when Ashford has answered for what she did, what will you do?" The question caught her off guard, forcing her to consider a future she had not allowed herself to imagine during 2 years, focused entirely on the singular goal of finding justice for her family. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "I have spent so long focused on this search that I have not considered what comes after." "You could stay," he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that reminded her of their conversation weeks earlier in the Eastern Garden, when he had first revealed the weight of responsibility he carried as ruler. "The treaty between our kingdoms still requires a marriage to maintain peace. But beyond that practical necessity, I find myself hoping you might choose to remain here, regardless of political obligation." Ilara felt her pulse quicken at the sincerity in his words, understanding that he was offering her something beyond simple political convenience, a genuine invitation to consider a future built on the connection that had grown between them despite the secrets and deception that had defined the earliest weeks of their relationship. "I came here as a weapon," she said quietly, "trained to deceive, to infiltrate, to find answers, through whatever means necessary. I do not know if that person deserves the future you are describing." "You came here carrying grief and determination," Kaylin corrected gently, reaching across the space between them to take her hand. "Everything you have done since your arrival, protecting me from assassination, working alongside Reyna to expose Halden's betrayal, pursuing justice for your family, with a persistence that would break most people. None of that describes someone unworthy of a genuine future. It describes someone extraordinary." His words settled into her chest with warmth she had not expected to feel, given how carefully she had guarded herself against vulnerability throughout her entire life. The Ashvale training had taught her to view emotional attachment as weakness, a liability that could be exploited by enemies seeking leverage. Yet standing here, in this quiet study, with snow falling steadily outside, and the man before her offering genuine partnership, rather than simple political obligation. She found herself questioning whether that lesson had ever truly served her, or whether it had simply protected her from the risk of loss she had already experienced once, and feared experiencing again. "I need to finish this first," she said finally, though she did not withdraw her hand from his. "I need to see justice served for my family before I can consider what future might exist beyond that reckoning." "Then we will finish it together," Kaylin said, "and afterward, we will discover together what future we might build from whatever remains." The promise settled between them, like something solid and real, a commitment that extended beyond political necessity, into something neither of them had anticipated when this arrangement first began. Ilara allowed herself, for the first time since the fire that destroyed her home, to imagine a future that included genuine connection, rather than simply the singular purpose of vengeance that had defined her existence for 2 long years. Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the fortress in quiet white silence that felt, for once, less like isolation and more like the peaceful stillness before something important finally began to unfold. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains, snow melting into rushing streams that carved fresh paths down the slopes surrounding the fortress, the frozen landscape gradually giving way to the first hints of green, pushing through soil that had been buried under white for months. The diplomatic gathering approached with growing urgency, preparations consuming every available hour as Kaylin's advisors worked to ensure his position remained secure, heading into a meeting that would place him in close proximity to a ruler he now understood to be responsible for a crime spanning far beyond simple territorial ambition. But before the gathering could take place, trouble arrived from within the fortress itself. Trouble that would test everything Ilara and Kaylin had built together far more severely than any external threat could have managed. It began quietly, a series of small inconsistencies that Reyna noticed during routine security reviews, guards reporting for duty at unusual hours, supply requisitions that did not match actual consumption, whispered conversations that fell silent whenever someone in authority approached. Individually, each detail seemed insignificant, easily explained by the ordinary chaos of a large fortress preparing for an important diplomatic journey. Together, they formed a pattern that made Reyna's carefully honed instincts scream warning. "Something is happening within our own walls," she reported to Kaylin and Ilara during a private meeting, called specifically to address her growing concerns. "I cannot yet identify the source, but the pattern suggests coordination, perhaps preparation for something significant." Kaylin's expression darkened with the weight of a ruler who had already survived one rebellion attempt during his father's reign and understood intimately the danger such coordination could represent. "Halden's exposure created uncertainty among the nobles who benefited from his corruption," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps others who shared his ambitions feel emboldened to act before their own connections face similar scrutiny." The following days brought increasing evidence supporting this theory. Reyna's careful investigation, revealing a network of nobles who had grown wealthy through arrangements similar to those Halden had maintained, individuals who understood that continued loyalty to Kaylin's increasingly thorough governance threatened their accumulated power and wealth. These nobles, it became clear, had begun coordinating a response, though the exact nature of their planned action remained frustratingly unclear, despite Reyna's best efforts to uncover it. Ilara found herself drawn back into the vigilant awareness that had defined her earliest days at the fortress, watching faces and behaviors with renewed attention, searching for the telltale signs of betrayal she had learned to recognize through years of Ashvale training. The comfortable rhythm that had developed over recent months, the growing sense that this fortress had become something close to home, felt suddenly fragile again, threatened by dangers emerging from within, rather than beyond the walls. The rebellion revealed itself 3 nights before the scheduled departure for the diplomatic gathering, striking with a coordination that confirmed months of careful planning by nobles who had grown desperate as Kaylin's investigations into corruption continued expanding beyond Halden's initial exposure. It began during what should have been a routine evening, guards changing shifts along the fortress walls, servants completing their final duties before retiring for the night, the quiet rhythm of fortress life proceeding as it had for months. Ilara noticed the first sign of trouble while walking toward her chambers after a late evening meeting with Kaylin regarding final preparations for their journey. A guard she recognized from the Eastern Watch stood in a hallway where he had no legitimate reason to be, his posture tense in a way that immediately triggered every instinct her training had honed. She slowed her pace, positioning herself carefully as she approached, watching his hands for any sign of concealed weapons. "You are far from your post," she said, keeping her voice light despite the tension coiling through her body. The guard's eyes flickered with something close to panic before his expression hardened into grim determination. "Apologies, my lady," he said, though his hand moved toward his sword hilt in a gesture that confirmed her instincts had been correct. She moved before he could complete the motion, closing the distance between them with speed that left him no opportunity to draw his weapon, disarming him with practiced efficiency and pressing him against the stone wall with enough force to prevent any struggle. "Who ordered you here?" she demanded, her voice sharp with controlled urgency. The guard's resistance crumbled quickly under the combination of physical restraint and evident danger, radiating from someone he had clearly underestimated. "Lord Brennan," he stammered. "There is a plan tonight to remove the king from power, to install someone more sympathetic to the council's traditional authority." The name meant little to Alara directly, but she understood immediately that the situation demanded urgent action. She left the disarmed guard bound and gagged in a nearby chamber, moving quickly through the fortress corridors toward Kaelin's private quarters, her mind racing through the implications of an organized rebellion striking on the very night before their planned departure. She found Reyna already alert and moving through the halls with similar urgency, having received warning through her own network of loyal contacts within the fortress. "Brennan has gathered support among nearly a dozen nobles," Reyna reported quickly, as they moved together toward Kaelin's chambers. "They plan to seize control tonight, while guard rotations create confusion, replacing Kaelin with his cousin, who has apparently been secretly courted by the conspirators for months." They reached Kaelin's chambers to find him already awake, alerted by the same instincts that had kept him alive through his father's brutal reign and the rebellion attempt that had claimed so much from his early years as ruler. He moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for this exact scenario, despite hoping never to face it again, arming himself while listening to Reyna's rapid briefing on the situation unfolding throughout the fortress. "How many conspirators do we face?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the danger closing around them. "Uncertain," Reyna admitted, "but enough to have compromised several guard positions throughout the fortress. We cannot trust the usual chain of command tonight." Sounds of struggle echoed from somewhere deeper in the fortress, confirming that the rebellion had already begun moving, beyond simple planning, into active confrontation. Kaelin's expression hardened with grim determination as he moved toward the door, prepared to face whatever conflict awaited them directly, rather than hiding while his fortress fell into chaos around him. "We need to reach the loyal guard captains," he said. "Rally forces we can actually trust, before the conspirators consolidate control over key positions throughout the fortress." Alara fell into step beside him without hesitation, every instinct from her Ashvale training focused now on protecting the man who had become far more than a mission over the past months, someone she genuinely feared losing to violence, orchestrated by nobles too cowardly to accept accountability for their own corruption. Reyna moved on his other side, weapon drawn, her loyalty and skill evident in every controlled movement, as they navigated corridors filled with growing chaos. They encountered their first serious resistance near the main hall, a group of conspirators attempting to secure the fortress's central chamber, clearly intending to use it as a staging point for whatever final confrontation they planned. Kaelin moved with the trained precision of a warrior king, engaging the nearest attacker, while Reyna covered his flank, her own combat skill evident despite her primary role as spymaster rather than soldier. Alara found herself moving through the chaos with the practiced efficiency her Ashvale training had instilled since childhood, disabling attackers with precise, controlled strikes that incapacitated without unnecessary violence, her focus entirely on protecting Kaelin and clearing a path toward the loyal guard positions they desperately needed to reach. The fighting felt different than anything she had experienced during her years of solitary missions, driven not by cold professional necessity, but by genuine fear of losing someone whose safety had become deeply personal to her. They fought their way through 3 separate confrontations before finally reaching the Eastern Guard Tower, where loyal soldiers had gathered under the leadership of a captain, whose devotion to Kaelin remained unshaken despite the chaos spreading through the rest of the fortress. Word spread quickly among these loyal forces that their king moved among them, rallying resistance against the conspiracy attempting to seize control through violence and betrayal. The battle that followed stretched through the remaining hours of night, loyal forces gradually pushing back against the conspirators, as coordination among Brennan's forces began fracturing under the pressure of facing organized resistance, rather than the confused chaos they had originally planned to exploit. Ilara fought alongside Kaelin and Reyna throughout, her skills proving invaluable in neutralizing key conspirators, whose capture provided crucial intelligence about the full scope of the rebellion. Dawn finally broke over the mountains as the last pockets of resistance surrendered. Lord Brennan himself captured attempting to flee through a hidden passage he had apparently prepared as an escape route should his coup attempt fail. The fortress, battered and exhausted from a night of violent conflict, slowly began the difficult process of accounting for the damage and casualties the rebellion had caused. Ilara found herself standing beside Kaelin in the fortress courtyard, as morning light spread across scenes of destruction that would require weeks to fully repair, both physical damage to the fortress itself and the deeper wounds of betrayal that would need careful healing among a court forced to confront how many among their ranks had been willing to embrace violence rather than accept accountability for corruption. "You saved my life again tonight," Kaelin said quietly, turning to face her amid the exhausted aftermath of battle. "I could not lose you," she said simply, too exhausted and too relieved by their survival to maintain the careful emotional distance she had once considered essential to her training. "Not after everything we have built together these past months." He studied her for a long moment, exhaustion and relief evident in his own expression, before reaching out to gently touch her face, a gesture more intimate than anything they had shared before despite the growing closeness that had developed between them. "Nor could I lose you," he said quietly. "Whatever happens with Ashford, whatever challenges still await us, I know now, with absolute certainty, that I want you beside me facing them, not as a political arrangement, but because I have come to care for you more deeply than I ever expected possible." The confession settled between them with quiet significance, unspoken feelings finally given voice amid the wreckage of a rebellion that had tested everything they had built together and found it, ultimately, strong enough to survive. The rebellion's aftermath demanded weeks of careful attention before the fortress could return to any semblance of normal function. Lord Brennan and his fellow conspirators faced formal judgment before Kaelin's council, their punishment severe enough to discourage future betrayal, while avoiding the excessive cruelty that had characterized his father's rule. Ilara watched these proceedings with careful attention, understanding better than most in the court the delicate balance rulers needed to maintain between justice and mercy, having spent years serving an order that valued precise, controlled response over unnecessary violence. The diplomatic gathering, initially threatened by the rebellion's disruption, was rescheduled for early summer, once the fortress had stabilized sufficiently to allow Kaelin's absence without risking further instability. This delay, though frustrating for Ilara's need to finally confront the truth about Ashford's involvement in her family's destruction, provided valuable additional time to gather stronger evidence and develop a more careful strategy for how that confrontation might eventually unfold. Reyna used the intervening weeks productively, her network of contacts expanding their investigation into Ashford's territory, gradually uncovering additional evidence that connected the Countess more directly to the mercenary payments Vane had described. Financial records obtained through careful diplomatic channels revealed patterns of unusual expenditure that aligned precisely with the timeline of the attack on the Ashvale compound, building a case that would prove far more difficult for Ashford to deny than Vane's testimony alone could have achieved. Kaelin, meanwhile, worked to strengthen alliances with neighboring rulers who might prove sympathetic to action against Ashford once the full scope of her crimes became known, understanding that any confrontation would require careful political support rather than simple accusation from a single kingdom whose ruler had personal reasons for pursuing the matter. These diplomatic efforts consumed much of his attention throughout the spring, though he made careful time to include Ilara in these discussions, valuing her strategic insight and understanding that the eventual resolution would need to satisfy her need for justice as much as broader political stability. Their relationship, forged through months of shared purpose and tested severely by the rebellion's violence, deepened into something neither of them attempted to hide from the court any longer. The formal wedding, delayed initially by the political complexities surrounding their arrival, and then further postponed by the rebellion's disruption, was finally scheduled to take place, shortly before their planned journey to confront Ashford, a decision that felt, to Alara, like claiming her own future, rather than simply fulfilling political obligation. The ceremony itself, when it finally occurred on a clear spring morning, with mountain wildflowers blooming throughout the fortress gardens, felt profoundly different from anything Alara had imagined when she first accepted this arrangement as a strategic opportunity to pursue her mission. Standing before Kaelin as vows were exchanged, surrounded by a court that had gradually come to respect and even admire the woman they had once viewed with deep suspicion, she found herself experiencing genuine joy rather than the careful performance she had expected when this journey first began. Reyna served as witness alongside Marion, both women having become genuine friends throughout the months of shared challenge and gradual trust building. The court celebrated with a feast that stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling halls that had witnessed such violence and betrayal only weeks earlier, the fortress itself seeming to breathe easier under the weight of celebration rather than conflict. But even amid this joy, Alara understood that the final reckoning with Ashford still awaited, unfinished business that would need resolution before she could fully embrace whatever future lay ahead. 2 weeks after the wedding, their diplomatic party departed for the gathering where Countess Ashford would finally stand before them, carrying with them evidence that Reyna's careful investigation had assembled into an undeniable case against the woman responsible for destroying everything Alara had once loved. The journey west toward the diplomatic gathering felt different from the difficult trip that had first brought Alara north, traveling now beside a husband whose support felt unshakable, rather than the isolation she had carried throughout years of solitary mission work. The gathering itself took place at a neutral territory, chosen specifically to allow multiple regional rulers to meet, without any single kingdom holding home advantage, a sprawling estate that had hosted similar diplomatic functions for generations. Countess Ashford arrived on the second day of the gathering, and Alara felt her entire body tense with controlled fury the moment she finally laid eyes on the woman responsible for the fire that had claimed her family 2 years earlier. Ashford appeared unremarkable at first glance, a woman of middle years with graying hair and a composed expression that gave no hint of the ruthless ambition that had driven her to order such devastating violence against innocent people who had posed no direct threat to her rule. Kaelin had arranged, through careful diplomatic maneuvering, a private meeting between the assembled rulers to discuss matters of regional security, providing the opportunity to present their evidence against Ashford without the theatrical spectacle of a public accusation that might allow her to deflect through political manipulation before the truth could be properly established. Alara stood beside Kaelin as the meeting began, her expression carefully controlled despite the storm of emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. "We have gathered here today to discuss a matter of significant concern," Kaelin began, his voice carrying the authority of a ruler, accustomed to commanding respect even among his political equals. "Evidence has emerged connecting Countess Ashford to the destruction of an independent order operating within the southern mountains 2 winters ago, an attack that killed dozens of innocent people who held no political allegiance and posed no legitimate threat to any territorial claim." Ashford's composed expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might simply have been practiced denial. Alara found it difficult to determine which, given years of experience recognizing deception that the Countess appeared equally skilled at employing. "I do not know what evidence you believe you possess," Ashford said, her voice steady despite the accusation. "But I assure you, I have no connection to whatever tragedy you describe." Reyna stepped forward then, presenting the carefully assembled documentation that weeks of investigation had produced. Financial records showing payments routed through intermediaries to the same mercenary company Vane had identified. Correspondence that, while carefully worded to avoid direct incrimination, revealed patterns of communication that aligned precisely with the timeline of the attack. The assembled rulers studied this evidence with growing concern, understanding the serious implications should such accusations against a fellow territorial ruler prove accurate. "This proves nothing beyond financial transactions that could have countless innocent explanations," Ashford insisted, though Alara noted the slight tremor that had begun creeping into her otherwise controlled voice. "Then perhaps you can explain," Alara said, stepping forward for the first time since the meeting began, unable to contain the need to face this confrontation directly, rather than allowing others to speak entirely on her behalf. Why a witness with direct knowledge of the transaction has already confirmed under formal testimony that you personally commissioned the attack, motivated by concern that the Ashvale Order's independence and skill posed a threat to your expanding territorial ambitions. The mention of the Ashvale name, spoken directly by Alara herself, seemed to finally shatter whatever composure Ashford had managed to maintain throughout the confrontation. Her eyes widened with genuine alarm as she studied Alara more carefully, understanding perhaps for the first time the true significance of the woman standing before her. "You," Ashford said quietly, horror creeping into her voice as recognition dawned. "You are one of them. One of the fighters I believed we had eliminated entirely. I am the last surviving member of an order you destroyed, based on nothing more than paranoid ambition," Alara said, her voice cold and controlled despite the fury burning beneath her composed exterior. "You killed people who had done nothing to threaten you beyond existing independently of your control. Children who had not yet completed their training. Elders who had dedicated their lives to teaching skills meant to protect, not to conquer." The assembled rulers watched this exchange with growing horror, understanding now the full weight of what Ashford's ambition had apparently cost, the casual destruction of an entire community, based on nothing more than preemptive fear that their capabilities might someday be turned against her territorial interests. Support that Ashford might have once commanded among her political peers evaporated visibly as the true scope of her crime became undeniable. "I did what was necessary," Ashford said, though her voice had lost the confident authority it carried at the meeting's beginning, replaced now with something closer to desperate justification. An independent force of trained fighters, loyal to no kingdom, willing to sell their services to whoever offered sufficient payment, represented a genuine threat that any responsible ruler would have addressed. "You did not address a threat," Kalen said, his voice carrying barely controlled fury at the casual dismissal of so many innocent lives. "You murdered innocent people, including children, based on paranoid speculation about a threat that existed only in your own ambitious imagination. That is not responsible governance. That is nothing more than the calculated cruelty of someone who values her own power above the lives of anyone who might theoretically inconvenience it." The gathered rulers, witnessing this confrontation and the mounting evidence that supported Alara's accusation, began withdrawing their political support from Ashford with visible speed, understanding that association with such casual disregard for innocent life carried significant risk to their own reputations should the full truth become widely known. Ashford's careful web of alliances, built over years of political maneuvering, began unraveling before their eyes as the assembled rulers reconsidered their willingness to maintain relationships with someone capable of ordering such devastating violence. "What do you intend to do?" Ashford asked finally, her voice carrying genuine fear as she recognized the collapse of her political standing among peers who had, until this confrontation, treated her as a respected equal. Alara considered the question carefully, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of 2 years spent pursuing justice for her family, the confrontation she had imagined countless times during long nights of grief and determination. Part of her, the part trained by years within the Ashvale Order, felt the pull toward the swift, decisive justice her training had prepared her to deliver, the kind of ending that would provide immediate, visceral satisfaction for the pain Ashford had caused. But she had grown, she realized, beyond the singular focus that had defined her existence for 2 years. The partnership she had built with Kalen, the trust developed with Reyna and the broader court, the understanding that justice, true justice, required more than simple violence. All of this had shaped her into someone capable of considering consequences beyond immediate satisfaction. "You will face formal judgment before an assembly of regional rulers," Alara said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "Your territory will be placed under careful oversight, while investigation continues into the full scope of your crimes, and any additional victims of your ambition, who deserve justice as well. You will not simply disappear quietly, allowed to maintain wealth and comfort while the families you destroyed continue grieving without acknowledgement or accountability." The decision surprised even Kalen, who had perhaps expected something more immediately final, given the depth of grief and anger Alara had carried throughout their journey toward this confrontation. But she understood, standing there amid the gathered rulers who would now bear witness to whatever formal justice eventually unfolded, that true resolution required more than simple violence could ever provide. It required accountability, acknowledgement, and the kind of lasting consequence that would prevent others from believing such casual destruction of innocent life could ever be dismissed without serious repercussion. Ashford was taken into custody by the assembled rulers, her territory placed under temporary joint administration, while formal investigation and judgment proceeded according to protocols the regional alliance had developed over generations for addressing crimes of such magnitude, committed by rulers who held significant political power. The process would take months, Elara understood, perhaps longer, but it would provide the kind of lasting justice that immediate violence, however satisfying in the moment, could never have achieved. As the gathering concluded and their diplomatic party began preparing for the journey home, Kaelin found Elara standing alone near the estate's gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors that felt, somehow, appropriate for the conclusion of a journey that had defined so much of her recent life. "You chose mercy over immediate justice," he said quietly, joining her at the garden's edge. "I chose lasting justice over immediate satisfaction," she corrected gently. "There is a difference, though I understand why they might appear similar from certain perspectives." He studied her for a long moment, pride and respect evident in his expression. "Your family would be proud of the person you have become," he said, "not simply skilled in the arts of protection and combat, but wise enough to understand that true justice requires more than simple vengeance." Elara felt tears gather unexpectedly at his words. 2 years of carried grief, finally finding some measure of peace, now that the truth had been exposed, and appropriate consequences set into motion. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing beside me through all of this. I could not have found this resolution without your support." "You would have found your way regardless," he said, taking her hand gently in his own. "But I am grateful, more grateful than I can adequately express, that I was given the chance to stand beside you throughout this journey, rather than simply watching from a distance." As the sun finally disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and gold, Elara allowed herself to feel, for the first time in 2 years, a sense of genuine peace settling through her chest. The mission that had brought her north, the deception she had once considered necessary for survival, had transformed into something far more meaningful than she had ever anticipated when this journey first began. The journey home from the diplomatic gathering felt entirely different from any travel Elara had experienced since first crossing the border into Kaelin's territory nearly a year earlier. Where that initial journey had carried the weight of secrecy and singular purpose, this return trip carried something closer to genuine contentment, the satisfaction of a mission finally completed, alongside the growing anticipation of whatever future now lay open before her. News of Ashford's exposure and the formal investigation into her crimes spread quickly throughout the northern territories during the weeks following their return to the fortress, prompting a wave of relief among smaller territories that had long feared the Countess's expanding ambitions without possessing sufficient evidence or political standing to challenge her directly. Elara received, through Reyna's careful monitoring of regional communications, numerous messages of gratitude from families who had suffered under Ashford's ruthless expansion, people who finally saw meaningful accountability approaching for suffering they had endured for years without adequate justice. The formal judgment against Ashford, when it finally concluded some months later, resulted in her removal from power and permanent exile, her territory placed under careful administration, designed to prevent the kind of unchecked ambition that had led to such devastating consequences for so many innocent people. It was not the swift, violent justice Elara might once have delivered herself, but it provided something perhaps more valuable, a lasting example that such casual disregard for innocent life carried genuine consequence, regardless of the political power someone might otherwise command. Life at the fortress settled into a new rhythm, following the resolution of both the internal rebellion and the external reckoning with Ashford, Kaelin's rule strengthening, as the court witnessed firsthand his commitment to justice and his willingness to root out corruption, regardless of the political complications such investigation might create. Elara found herself, gradually and somewhat to her own surprise, embracing a role within the court that extended far beyond the careful disguise she had originally adopted, becoming a genuine advisor whose strategic insight and combat expertise proved invaluable in strengthening the kingdom's overall security. She began, with Kaelin's enthusiastic support, developing a training program for select members of the Fortress Guard, sharing carefully chosen elements of Ashvale technique that could strengthen the kingdom's defensive capabilities without revealing the full scope of secrets that Order had once protected so carefully. Reyna proved a particularly apt student, her existing skill as spy master enhanced significantly by the additional combat training Alara provided, and their partnership deepened into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting the kingdom they both now called home. Marion, the steward who had first uncovered the crucial lead connecting Vane to the mercenary transaction, continued serving the fortress with quiet efficiency, though she often mentioned to Alara, with the kind of affectionate pride reserved for someone who had watched a difficult transformation unfold, how far the southern bride had come from the frightened, uncertain woman who had first arrived at the fortress gates. Kaelin and Alara's partnership, forged through such difficult circumstances and tested by rebellion and the pursuit of justice across territorial boundaries, continued deepening throughout the following months into something that felt, to both of them, like the genuine foundation for a lasting future, rather than simply the political arrangement that had originally brought them together. Their conversations, once carefully guarded exchanges between two people testing each other's true intentions, evolved into the easy, comfortable communication of genuine partners who trusted each other completely, with both strategic decisions and personal vulnerabilities. One evening, nearly a year after Alara had first arrived at the fortress disguised as a frightened bride, she found herself standing once again in the eastern garden, where she and Kaelin had shared so many important conversations throughout their journey together. The frost that had covered these flower beds during her first visit had long since given way to full summer bloom, vibrant colors filling the garden with a beauty that felt, to her, symbolic of how far both her personal journey and their relationship had traveled since those uncertain early days. Kaelin joined her there as the sun began setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had accompanied their confrontation with Ashford months earlier, though this evening carried none of that earlier tension, only quiet contentment shared between two people who had built something genuine and lasting together. "Do you remember," he asked, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench, "our conversation here, so long ago, when I first asked what you expected from this arrangement?" "I remember," she said, smiling at the memory of that careful, guarded exchange between two people who had not yet learned to trust each other. "I told you I did not know what to expect." "And now?" he asked, echoing the same question he had posed that evening, though the context surrounding it had transformed so completely since then. "What do you expect now, looking toward whatever future still lies ahead of us?" Alara considered the question carefully, drawing on everything she had experienced since first accepting this arrangement as a strategic opportunity to pursue justice for her destroyed family. She had arrived seeking vengeance, carrying grief and determination that had defined her entire existence for 2 difficult years. She had found, instead, something she had never expected to discover: genuine partnership, lasting friendship, and a love that had grown organically from mutual respect and shared purpose rather than any careful political calculation. "I expect," she said finally, taking his hand in her own, "that we will continue building something worth protecting together. Not simply peace between our kingdoms, though that remains important, but a genuine partnership built on trust and mutual respect. I expect we will face whatever challenges still await us, as we have faced everything so far, together rather than alone." Kaelin smiled, the genuine warmth that had grown increasingly familiar over their months together, and leaned forward to press a gentle kiss against her forehead. "That is precisely what I hope for as well," he said quietly. "You arrived here as a stranger the council believed would simply fulfill political obligation. And you have become instead the truest partner I could have ever hoped to find. Someone whose strength matches my own, whose wisdom guides my decisions, and whose presence has transformed this fortress from simple duty into something I now genuinely consider home." The words settled into her chest with warmth that no amount of Ashvale training could have prepared her to feel, a genuine happiness that felt entirely earned after everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had ultimately gained throughout this remarkable journey. She had been sent north as an offering, a political arrangement meant to secure peace between warring kingdoms, carrying secrets and purpose that no one in that southern council could have ever imagined. She had arrived as the deadliest hunter alive, disguised as a frightened bride, prepared to use whatever skills necessary to uncover the truth about her family's destruction. She had found that truth, delivered lasting justice through careful patience, rather than simple violence, and discovered along the way something she had never expected to find: genuine love, built on trust, rather than deception; partnership, built on mutual strength, rather than simple political convenience. As the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, and stars began emerging across the darkening sky, Ilara allowed herself to fully embrace the future stretching ahead of her, no longer defined by the singular pursuit of vengeance that had once consumed her every waking thought, but instead, by the genuine partnership and lasting peace she had built alongside a man who had proven himself worthy of the trust she had once believed she could never extend to anyone again. The Wolf King and his queen, once strangers bound only by political necessity, had become something far more powerful than either had anticipated when their difficult journey first began. Together, they had faced betrayal from within their own court, pursued justice across territorial boundaries, and built a foundation of trust and genuine affection that would guide their kingdom toward a future defined by fairness, strength, and the kind of lasting peace that came not from simple political arrangement, but from two people choosing, again and again, to stand together against whatever challenges the world might still present. And somewhere in the mountains surrounding their fortress home, actual wolves called out into the night, their distant howls no longer carrying the ominous warning Ilara had once heard on her first night in this territory, but instead, something closer to a peaceful lullaby, welcoming her fully into the life and the love she had never expected to find, yet had ultimately claimed as entirely her own.